It's one of the world's largest, most complex, and beautiful freshwater delta ecosystems. It is recognized internationally for its ecological, historical, and cultural significance. It is a mosaic of terrestrial, wetland, and lake habitats, having notably high biological productivity. This is the Peace-Athabasca Delta. This flat terrain is a patchwork of marshes, lakes, mudflats, meadows, willow thickets, and forests of white spruce and balsam poplar, interwoven with numerous winding river and stream channels. This boreal forest region contains and supports a diverse mixture of animal species. This freshwater delta is part of Wood Buffalo National Park, designated by the United Nations as a World Heritage Site. A remote and pristine wilderness, Wood Buffalo National Park is primarily a nature preserve and not a recreational area. The closest community of significant size is the town of Fort Chipewyan, sandwiched between the Canadian Shield and the Delta. Located on the western tip of Lake Athabasca, one of Canada's largest lakes, Fort Chipewyan is 200 kilometers north of Fort McMurray and the Alberta oil sands. The current community occupies a significant historic site on a major fur trade route of 200 years ago. The fort was built on the fur trade. It was located here. Fort Chipewyan is Alberta's oldest continuous European settlement, dating back to 1788, when the Northwest Company established an outpost here. Today, it supports a population of between 1,100 and 1,300 residents. For most of the 20th century, the major economic activities in the Fort Chipewyan area were trapping, fishing, and lumbering. In recent years, the economy has benefited from expenditures by government and from work in the oil sands. The local First Nations, through their administrations and businesses, are major employers in the town. Today, Fort Chipewyan has many programs and facilities to fill its educational, recreational, health, social, and cultural needs. The only road access to the town is by winter ice roads to Fort McMurray and to Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories. Transportation in and out of Fort Chipewyan in the spring, summer, and fall months is by boat or by air. Tourism in the immediate area improved in the late 1980s with the opening of this adventure lodge. Fort Chipewyan is still populated by Aboriginal peoples, the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, the Mikisew Cree First Nation, and the Métis descendants of the fur traders. The Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation's largest reserve is across the lake from the town, on the southwestern tip of Lake Athabasca in the Athabasca River Delta. The Mikisew Cree First Nation has over 2,200 members. One of its reserves is located adjacent to Fort Chipewyan, with another on the north bank of the Peace River, just outside the Delta. Local people continue to use the delta, hunting for country food, trapping muskrat and fine furs, and for recreation. Some residents keep seasonal homes on the delta. The Peace-Athabasca Delta is a complex of interconnected channels and a myriad of lake basins of varying characteristics. Its lakes, rivers, streams, ponds, marshes, and meadows are habitat for at least 20 species of fish, 42 species of mammals, and 215 species of birds. 5 international migratory bird flyways meet in the delta. As well as bear, moose, and to a lesser extent caribou, this area is home to the world's largest free-roaming herd of bison, numbering over 4,000 in 2005. Remote and pristine, during the fur trading era, this delta was one of Canada's richest trapping areas. Changes in fashion and lifestyle have reduced the demand for the delta's furs, and today few people make a living in this way. At 6,000 square kilometers in overall size, the moribund portion originally formed by the Peace River takes up 1,800 square kilometers. The active Athabasca River takes up 2,500 square kilometers. The growing Birch River Delta takes up 200 square kilometers, with the balance taken up by the large delta lakes, Clare, Mamawi, and Richardson. 83% of the delta, including the Peace and Birch River portions, lies within Wood Buffalo National Park. 11.5% of the delta is Alberta Crown land, and the remaining 5.5% is Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation Reserve. The 2 rivers that give the delta its name originate in the Rocky Mountains. It's here that each spring, water from melting snow and ice trickles down from the mountains and drains into Williston Lake, the largest man-made lake in British Columbia. From here, the water enters the Peace River. The Peace River finishes its 2,000-kilometer journey as it joins with outflow from Lake Athabasca and the Peace-Athabasca Delta to form the Slave River. To the south, the Athabasca River originates at the Columbia Ice Fields in the Rocky Mountains, passes through the town of Fort McMurray and the Alberta oil sands, and ends its 1,200-kilometer course at Lake Athabasca. Since the landscape of the delta is relatively flat, many of its waterways can flow in 2 directions. The direction of the flow depends upon the relative water levels in different parts of the delta. When the water level in Lake Athabasca is higher than the Peace River, which is usually the case, water flows north into the Slave River. Occasionally, during ice jams or very high summer flows, the Peace River is higher and water stops flowing north, or may even flow south into Lake Athabasca.
So it takes unique circumstances for the water to actually flow south from the Peace. It was noted way back in 1930 by Hugh Raup, when he was doing some pioneering work here in terms of botany and landscape, that the Peace has abandoned the delta. It's actually at a lower elevation than most of the deltas. Most of the water flows down the Peace and then right out into the Slave and down to the north, whereas the Athabasca, carrying less water, it still contributes more water to the delta because all of its water flow enters the delta. The Athabasca contributes more water to the delta because the Athabasca enters the delta upstream of the delta, whereas the Peace is actually downstream of the delta.
Many of the small lakes of the delta exist as perched basins that are only replenished through rainfall and snowmelt, or by periodic spring flooding caused by ice jams on the Peace, Athabasca, and other major delta rivers. Between floods, the perched basins slowly dry because in boreal forest environments, evaporation often exceeds precipitation. The vitality of this ecosystem is believed to be strongly dependent upon periodic flooding. The ecosystem fluctuates over time as the amount of water rises and falls. In wet times, the delta is essentially a huge wetland. In dry times, the delta becomes more like parkland. The Peace-Athabasca Delta's hydrology is complex. It contains a myriad of lake basins of varying characteristics and many interconnected channels. 4 large and shallow basins dominate the interior of the delta. They include Lakes Beryl, Mamawee, Richardson, and Lake Claire, Alberta's largest lake. Together with a few other small lakes, they comprise the open drainage basins, basins that are always connected to major rivers. Other basins, called restricted basins, are connected to the rivers only during high river flows. Most of the small lakes are perched above the level of the delta rivers, getting water only from precipitation, snowmelt, and periodic flooding caused by ice jams. The most recent major ice jam occurred in 1997, when the Peace and Athabasca rivers, as well as some internal delta rivers, jammed during spring breakup, causing water to overtop the riverbanks and fill many perched basins.
99, things were drying out by the year 2002, which was an extremely dry summer across much of North America. The delta was quite dry again, and this year, 2005, the major precipitation upstream, the delta seems to be wetter than typical.
During the 1970s, a considerable amount of effort went into stabilizing the water levels of the delta through the construction of weirs along 3 channels. The weirs were intended to reduce the outward flow of water while still allowing Peace River floods to wash into the delta. The weirs proved effective in retaining water. The Quatre Fourches weir was later removed because it kept waters artificially high in Lakes Mamawee and Claire. Over the past millennium, this complex and dynamic region has undergone several prolonged dry periods that temporarily turned some basins from aquatic into terrestrial ecosystems. The driest period occurred in the 1700s, followed by another lengthy drought in the mid-1800s. The early part of the 20th century was relatively wet, followed by progressive drying beginning about 1950. In the spring of 1996 and 1997, there were major floods due to high spring runoff and ice jams on the Peace and Athabasca rivers. The water replenished perched basins. The landscape of the delta is constantly changing as the major rivers seek the shortest path to their destination. In 1972, the Athabasca River was set to change its course, possibly bypassing Lake Athabasca. But engineering works by Alberta prevented redirection. 10 years later, the Embarrass River, an offshoot of the Athabasca, did make a jump, changing its main direction of flow away from Lake Athabasca and into Creed Creek and Mamawee Lake.
Well, since 1993, there have been several changes. The most prominent, I guess, being the increasing flow that's coming through through Cree Creek has resulted in a major growth of the Cree Creek Delta over that time. And as more water continues to flow down Cree Creek from the Embra and upstream contribution from the Athabasca main stem, the landscape around Cree Creek has become wetter with time. So in general, we find places like Otter Lake and the basins in that area, and Twin Lakes. Those areas seem to be getting wetter with time.
Flooding in this remote northern part of the province of Alberta spurs the high biological productivity for which the Delta is famous. Both flooding and drought are vital, especially to the perched ponds and lakes that are separated from the open water channel system. BC Hydro has been involved in scientific studies in the Peace-Athabasca Delta since 1993. Over the years, the utility has funded studies looking at waterfowl and muskrat populations, habitat and geomorphic changes in the Delta since 1927, ice jam physics and flood frequency, and the climate and ecology of the Delta over the past 1,000 years. BC Hydro has undertaken its own hydrotechnical work, seeking to improve understanding of how water gets to the Delta and what happens to it once there. An extensive water monitoring program, including strategic placement of numerous scientific instruments and on-the-ground surveys, allows tracking of variations in hydrology from year to year. The area is so vast and varied that work can only be accomplished by boat and helicopter. The result of these studies has greatly added to the understanding of the Delta, including the complex factors that lead to hydrological changes in the region.
It was clear to us that additional science needed to be done to fully understand the Peace-Athabasca Delta and hydro's impact, if any, on it. But we set out to really determine if it had changed since the dam went in. If it had changed, how had it changed, and why had it changed. So that's been the aim of our studies.
BC Hydro is proud to have contributed to improving Canadians' understanding of this unique and beautiful part of our natural heritage, including understanding the impacts of natural and human-induced changes to the ecosystem.